57 women, 31 children, barefoot, exhausted, erased, forced to dig gold for a Western company on the edge of Burkina Faso, not with machines but with their hands, their skin, their silence. One girl whispered, "They took my mother yesterday." And when President Traoré heard that he didn't send an order, he came. No motorcade, no press, just a plain jacket and 5 words that would change everything. Not anymore, it ends now. So why did a head of state walk into a slave pit instead of hiding behind protocol? And who were the powerful men turning children into shadows for profit? What you're about to hear is a fictional story, but the pain is real, the injustice is real, and the questions it raises about power, silence, and the cost of turning away they're real too. This is not just a story about suffering, it's about resistance. It's about a nation that chose to rise, and a voice in the dust that finally got heard. The sun didn't rise that morning. It crawled slow and searing across a sky already swollen with heat. The convoy moved in silence, tires crushing the cracked dirt like bones beneath their weight. There were no flags on the trucks, no emblems, just dust-covered metal rolling toward the northern border of Burkina Faso, where the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Inside the lead vehicle sat a man not dressed like a president, no sash, no security entourage, no camera crew. Just a tan jacket, a faded cap, and eyes that had seen too much silence to trust it anymore. His name was Traoré, and today he wasn't coming as a leader. He was coming as a witness. He hadn't told the press, not even his full cabinet. Only a handful of soldiers knew the real reason for this journey. A tip had reached his desk, anonymous, trembling handwriting, scanned into a dusty envelope. Children, digging, screaming, but no one hears us. For weeks he had watched satellites circle the border. For months there had been whispers, companies with no names, workers with no IDs camps that appeared and vanished like ghosts. But nothing prepared him for what they were about to see. As they reached the top of a low ridge, the driver cut the engine. All at once the noise stopped. No birds, no insects, just the wind dry furious, scraping across the rocks like fingernails on old bone. Traoré stepped out of the vehicle. The air hit him like a wall, heavy, bitter. The earth below was not golden, it was red, soaked in dust and heat, and something older, something broken. Then he heard it, not a scream, not yet, but the sound of hands, bare hands, scraping through gravel. He moved slowly to the edge of the ridge, and that's when he saw them. There were no machines, no safety gear, no helmets, no signs of a legitimate mine. Only women bent at the waist pulling shallow pans filled with muddy stones, and beside them children, dozens of them, no older than 6, maybe 7, clawing at the dirt, elbows bleeding, faces hollow from hunger and sun. One boy had a piece of broken metal tied to his hand, like a digging tool. A little girl sat in a pit trying to lift a rock larger than her head. They weren't working. They were surviving. Traoré didn't move. For a moment, neither did time. The wind picked up swirling dust across the valley, and then a shout, sharp, guttural. A guard, armed and restless, barked orders in a language that didn't belong to this land. He didn't notice the convoy on the ridge. Not yet. But someone did. From deep in the pit, a girl no older than 8 looked up. Her eyes met Traoré's. They weren't afraid. They were exhausted. And then barely above a whisper, she mouthed, "They took my mother yesterday." Traoré's breath caught in his chest. Something cracked inside him, but not with rage. Not yet. With recognition. He had seen many forms of suffering before, but never one this carefully hidden. He reached for the radio clipped to his collar, but hesitated. This wasn't just a crisis. This was a crime. Around him, the soldiers shifted uneasily. They had trained for insurgents, not this. Not bare feet digging gold out of the ribs of a dying earth. One soldier whispered, "Sir, do we engage?" Traoré didn't answer right away. He stepped forward. Then again, dust curled around his boots like smoke. "Not yet," he said. "Not with guns, not with noise. We came here to listen first, because something about this place, the silence, the dust, the way the land swallowed screams, told him the real story wasn't just about what they were doing. It was about what had been allowed, what had been ignored, what had been buried. And he knew if he turned away now, he'd become part of that silence. So he stared into the valley, eyes fixed on the guards, the workers, the children with blistered palms, and he whispered to no one and everyone no more. What happens next would not be broadcast live, but it would shake the gold-soaked silence of the border forever. And somewhere beneath the dust, a voice had just been heard. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The little girl simply looked up, mud caked to her cheeks, lips cracked, eyes dark from more than just the sun. Her voice, if it could be called that, floated up through the heat like smoke. They took my mother yesterday. Not a plea, not even a question, just a statement of fact. And somehow that made it worse. The men behind Traoré shifted. One instinctively reached for his weapon, another swallowed hard. But the president didn't move. His face stayed stone still, unreadable. His eyes locked onto the girls. And for a moment there was only the sound of gravel and breathing. Then softly but firmly, without turning to anyone, Traoré said just 4 words. Evacuate them. Feed them. A pause. And then one more. Don't let the children cry. The command didn't echo. It didn't need to. It landed like a quiet thunder inside the hearts of every soldier present. Within seconds, gears shifted. Orders relayed in low voices. Radios clicked on. The small group of elite rescue personnel disguised as transport support moved into formation. They had trained for ambushes, for insurgents, for cross-border fire. But not for this. Not for saving barefoot girls with broken wrists. Not for lifting boys out of pits where their fingernails had become shovels. Yet none of them hesitated. They moved like shadows through heat, precision without panic, silence without fear. 2 soldiers approached the girl, crouched beside her without speaking. One offered water. The other knelt down and extended his hand. She stared at it as if unsure what it was. Slowly she reached out. Her fingers didn't wrap around his. They simply rested there. Below the ridge, the mining guards had noticed. Their movements turned stiff. One tried to radio. Another reached for a holster. But from the ridge came no warning shot, no raised voice. Just the cold focus of trained eyes and a quiet promise that if anyone moved wrong, this would be over before the trigger was pulled. Traoré remained standing on the ridge, arms behind his back, watching, not interfering, but not absent, like a judge in a courtroom where no one had expected a trial. A medic found a woman barely breathing tied to a post with wire. Another discovered a child unconscious under a tarp, a piece of paper in his pocket, property of MTLXJ. A name, a code, a company no one knew. Yet, back at the makeshift camp, tents were being raised. Food, real food, distributed. Shade tarps extended. Children blinked at the sight of blankets and water bottles as if they were miracles. A boy refused to take his boots off. "They'll make me run again," he whispered. "No," the rescue worker said, kneeling beside him. "There's no running here, just resting." And nearby, the girl who had spoken first now sat in silence, clutching a piece of bread. Her knees trembled, but her hands didn't. Her hands, thus small, were steady. She hadn't told Traoré her name. He hadn't asked, but they both understood something unspoken, that survival was a language on its own. Later that evening, as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, the full scope of the valley revealed itself. Over 90 individuals, mostly Nigerian women and children, no documents, no IDs, no record of employment, no permission to be there. Just a broken operation with veins of gold running under it and human bones scattered around its surface, half buried in the dust. A captain approached Traoré with a file. "Sir, we're still identifying the language spoken by the guards. Most weren't local." Traoré nodded once. "They won't return, but we will." Then, without waiting for more words, he walked into the camp. Not as a president, but as a man who had once been a child in a war-torn village, who remembered the smell of dust and fear, who understood that the difference between being saved and being silenced sometimes came down to whether someone decided to listen. And in this valley where the earth had swallowed so many screams, one whisper had finally made it through. Not because it was loud, but because someone had heard it. The tents were quiet now. Children slept, their bodies curled like question marks, small hands still clenching dirt as if afraid to let go. Women huddled in silence, not speaking, not crying because silence had been safer for too long. The air had cooled slightly, but the dust still hung heavy, as if the land itself refused to settle, unsure whether this peace was real or just another pause before the next cruelty. Behind the main rescue zone stood a cluster of old wooden structures, half sheds, half shacks, leaning together like tired bones. No one had dared enter them earlier. Not yet. But now with the guards gone and the camp under control, the soldiers moved in. The smell inside was sharp oil, old rope sweat, and something else metallic and sour. A medic stepped back coughing. "Something died in here," he muttered. But what they found wasn't a body, not this time. On a rickety desk lit by the flicker of a handheld torch sat a leather-bound notebook. Weathered, creased, the edges curled like burnt paper. It looked almost insignificant until they opened it. No names, no explanations. Just dates, weights, numbers. Columns of shipment logs, tons of ore recorded down to the gram. Daily quotas measured like blood. And beside some of the entries, 3 words written, not in haste, but with chilling precision: no witnesses required. No witnesses remained. No witnesses. Each page confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. This wasn't just illegal labor. It was erasure. A system designed to produce wealth not just through forced hands, but through vanished mouths. One soldier flipped to the last page. A crude map. Coordinates scrawled in the margin. A symbol, 2 interlocking triangles stamped in red ink. No logo. No company name. Just a single initial M. The captain in charge closed the notebook slowly, as if afraid it might burn him. He turned to where Traoré stood at the entrance. The president hadn't spoken for minutes, just stood still watching the dust drift through the air like ash. The captain approached and offered the notebook with both hands. Traoré didn't take it. He didn't even look at it. Instead, his gaze moved across the camp at the sleeping children, the bruised women, the valley that had screamed without a voice for too long. His jaw clenched, but his eyes remained calm. Icy, focused. He finally spoke soft, but without softness. "This land will not fund cruelty." The wind picked up again, as if it had been waiting for something to say, and in that moment the valley listened. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for food. She didn't even flinch when the helicopters passed low overhead, scattering the dust around her like a broken storm. She just sat there, legs folded beneath her arms, wrapped tight around a girl no older than 5, skinny, silent, barefoot. The child's eyes were closed, asleep or something close to it. But the woman stayed upright, spine rigid, as if the earth below her had promised to collapse the moment she relaxed. They found her near the edge of the southern ravine, behind what was once a storage shed, but now looked more like a collapsed tomb. Her clothes were torn, sun-bleached, crusted with dirt. Her hands were bruised, palms split, but her grip on the girl was gentle, delicate, even, as if she feared that letting go would undo what little sanity remained. When the medics approached, she didn't resist. She didn't run. She simply shook her head slowly when they asked her name. Again and again they tried. Different languages, soft tones. She looked at them clearly, understanding, but never opened her mouth. Not once. Eventually they stopped asking. They brought water, bread, a thermal blanket. She accepted the blanket but draped it over the girl instead. And when a young rescue worker offered to carry the child to a shaded tent, the woman didn't protest, but she walked beside them the entire way, hand on the girl's shoulder, eyes forward, mouth closed. Later that night, after the camp had settled and the first real calm returned to the valley, Traoré made his way through the tents. No cameras, no speeches, just his quiet footsteps on coarse ground. That's when he saw her sitting beside the girl, who was now resting on a cot wrapped tightly in layers of linen and wool. The woman didn't notice him at first. She was humming, barely audible. A lullaby without lyrics, barely a note. But it was there. A sound, something like memory. When she finally turned and saw him, she didn't rise. She didn't salute or lower her eyes like many others. She simply looked at him as one human might look at another across an unbearable silence. And then she nodded, once, slow, deliberate, not out of fear, but recognition. Traoré sat beside her, said nothing for a while. Then in a voice barely above the wind, he asked, "What's her name?" Still the woman didn't speak, but this time her lips moved, forming a shape. Just one word breathed without breath: Ifunanya. He repeated it, Ifunanya, as if tasting something sacred. The child stirred slightly at the sound, and then silence again. The records would later show no trace of this woman in any database. No ID, no passport, just a name whispered by a few survivors, Chidima. A name that once belonged to a young girl from a village near the Delta. A girl who had once stood in front of a mirror practicing how to say "good morning class" because she dreamed of being a teacher. She had studied hard. She was the first in her family to finish secondary school. She had a scholarship pending papers ready. But then the raids began. One night men came in trucks, no plates, no warning. Her father was beaten. Her mother screamed. And Chidima was taken, along with 20 others. They stripped her of her name first, then her future, then her voice. But they didn't take her hands. And in those hands, years later, she now held Ifunanya, someone else's child perhaps, or maybe her own. No one could tell. She never said. Some stories come out screaming, others are written in scars. Chidima's story lived in silence. But even silence, when held long enough, begins to echo. That night, Traoré didn't ask more questions. He didn't offer promises or platitudes. He simply stood, looked at the girl one last time, then said quietly, "You're safe now, both of you." And though Chidima gave no reply, her eyes, dark, unflinching, said everything. The camp moved slowly at dawn like an animal learning how to breathe again. The night had brought rest, but not peace. Children whimpered in their sleep. Women stirred but did not speak. A few men sat with their backs to the sun, watching the horizon, as if expecting it to reverse and give them yesterday back. Amid the canvas tents and temporary cots, a soft routine had begun: water bandages, quiet meals handed out with eyes that avoided contact. The medics worked gently, moving like ghosts in uniforms too clean for this kind of pain. No one raised their voice. Even laughter, when it came, arrived timid, like a bird that had flown into the wrong season. And through all of it, Traoré walked alone. He wore no suit, no presidential sash, just an old linen shirt rolled at the sleeves and boots that still carried the red dust of the valley. He stopped at every cot, sometimes with a nod, sometimes a hand on a shoulder, sometimes just silence. There were no introductions, no cameras, only the presence of a man who did not come to lead that morning, but to see. He sat with a boy whose arm had been broken and badly healed, with a woman who had tried to chew off a zip tie to save her sister, with a child who would not let go of a rusted metal spoon, his only possession, and in every face, every voice that refused to form words, there was a mirror of something he recognized: the cost of being forgotten. He was halfway through the camp when he saw her again, Chidima sitting by Ifunanya's cot, still holding the child's hand, as if it were a bridge keeping her from falling. She looked up when he approached, just as she had the night before. Their eyes met again, and for a moment it was as if time folded into itself. Traoré crouched beside them, not as a politician, but as a man with dust in his lungs and 1,000 questions he knew better than to ask. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. And then, after all the silence, she did. Her voice was not strong. It wasn't clear or confident. It cracked in the middle and barely escaped her lips. "You're the one from the radio?" Traoré blinked, startled not by the fact that she spoke, but by what she said. She didn't say president. She didn't say help. She said radio. And with that one line, the moment bent. Not into ceremony, but into something far more human. He smiled just slightly. "You heard me?" Chidima nodded, eyes soft but unblinking. "A long time ago, in the mine. We had a radio. One of the guards left it on sometimes. There was a voice, not angry, just steady. It said, 'We are not what we were forced to do.' I remembered that. I repeated it." She paused, then whispered again, this time not to him, but almost to herself. "We are not what we were forced to do." Traoré sat back on his heels, his throat tight. That line, something he had written 2 years ago, late at night in a studio, when no one was listening, when hope felt paper thin, had traveled all the way here. Through static, through walls, through the dirt. It had survived in her, in this valley. He looked at Chidima, not as a survivor, not even as a symbol, but as a keeper of something fragile and sacred, a memory that refused to die. "If you remembered that," he said quietly, "then you saved her long before we arrived." She didn't answer, but her grip on Ifunanya's hand grew tighter. He rose, dusted his hands, and nodded to the medic behind him. "Make sure she's given her own tent, and anything she needs. She's not a victim. She's part of the record now." As he walked away, Chidima watched him go, lips closed again, but her eyes held something new. Not trust, not yet, but maybe belief. And nearby, someone turned on a small radio static, fizzed, then cleared, and a voice returned to the valley. It wasn't clean, it wasn't bright. The red cloth she wore draped loosely across her shoulder wasn't silk or satin. It was rough, frayed at the edges, and stained in places no washing could undo. To most, it looked like a rag. Something forgotten, a scrap too old to matter. But she never took it off. Even in the heat, even when the medics offered clean blankets or cooler garments, she kept it close, folded across her shoulder, pressed to the child's back as they slept, wrapped loosely around her arm when she walked, as if it were not just fabric but something alive. Some of the rescue workers whispered about it. Maybe it's a keepsake, a religious token, or a uniform from before, but no one asked her directly. They knew better. There was something in the way she touched it gently, yet with a grip that refused separation, that warned them it wasn't just cloth. Traoré noticed it too. He saw it in the way she folded it each morning, smooth and slow, as if ironing grief with her palms. The way she lifted it to her lips once before drinking water like a quiet ritual. And though she never spoke of it, the red cloth began to carry weight, not as an object, but as a presence. A witness that could not be silenced. That morning as he passed her tent, he paused, not as a leader this time, not even as a comforter, but as a man who understood that symbols weren't created by speeches, but by pain that refused to vanish. He gestured to the cloth with a glance. She met his eyes for a moment, then for the first time she offered it to him. Not to give it away, just to let him feel it. He reached out, brushing his fingers across the worn edge. It was coarse. Torn. It carried the smell of ash and sun and something else, time. "What is it?" he asked gently. She looked down at it, smiled not with joy, but with memory. "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "She tied it around my waist when I was little. Said it would remind me I belonged somewhere, even if I got lost." She paused. Her eyes drifted beyond the camp, beyond the tents, beyond the pain. "They tried to take it, many times. I hid it in the seams of my clothes, sewed it into my skirts, wrapped it around my ribs. It's not cloth anymore. Not to me. It's everything they couldn't take." Traoré nodded slowly, reverently, then returned it to her hand. She folded it again, rested it across her shoulder, and looked out into the dust. Her voice, when it came again, was no longer trembling. "They thought they buried me." A pause. And then, with a certainty that could shatter stone, "They didn't bury me. They woke me." The sun outside was mild that morning, but inside the presidential compound, the air was thick, heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what was coming. The cabinet room was silent. No chatter, no clearing of throats, no ceremonial greetings, just the slow shuffle of papers and a faint hum from the central fan, as 12 ministers waited for the man they all served, but now weren't quite sure they understood anymore. Then the doors opened, and Traoré entered. No tie, no speechwriter, no interpreter. He carried only a leather folder, worn cracked clasp, half broken. He didn't sit at first, didn't speak. He walked to the head of the long polished table, opened the folder, and began laying photographs face up on the lacquered wood, one by one, slowly, methodically. First a close-up, a boy's hands, blistered fingernails, blackened, clutching a pan of red-stained gravel. Then a woman's backlash, marks deep layered over years. Then the eyes of a child staring upward through a cage of dirt and wire. 12 photos, 12 seats. One photo in front of each minister. No one moved. Then finally he spoke. His voice was quiet but stripped of all ceremony. "This is not a scandal." He paused. Let the weight hang in the air like a verdict. "This is betrayal." Several ministers shifted in their seats. One cleared his throat but said nothing. The Minister of Energy, face tense, glanced at the photo in front of him, then looked away. Another, a junior trade secretary, dared to speak. "Mr. President, we had no knowledge. These are border operations, outside federal contracts. These appear to be rogue actors." "Stop." The word cut the air, not shouted. Just absolute. Do not confuse ignorance with innocence. And do not hide behind paperwork while children dig with bones. Silence. He leaned forward, palms on the table. This isn't just about illegal mining. It's about what we've allowed to happen when our backs were turned or when we chose to look the other way. This is the soil of our nation, and it's been bleeding. A flicker of movement. The Minister of Defense leaned in. Sir, if this is confirmed to involve foreign stakeholders, this could escalate. Sanctions, trade retaliation, investment pullouts. We could see currency destabilization within weeks. Traoré's face didn't change. Then let it destabilize. Gas half swallowed. One minister muttered something under his breath, but Traoré pressed on. What we stabilize at the cost of humanity doesn't deserve to survive. If we trade children for foreign debt forgiveness, if we silence women for infrastructure loans, then what's left of us to defend? A long pause. And then slowly he sat. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't have to, because the red in the photographs had stained the room far deeper than any paint ever could. It had turned the table into a crime scene. It had made every seat feel complicit. Traoré looked around the room, his gaze passing through each man and woman like light through glass. We will find every contract, every shadow firm, every shell entity registered offshore. We will name them. We will freeze their assets. And we will tell the world exactly what we found, where we found it, and who profited from it. No one dared reply. And if any of you signed, approved, overlooked, or pocketed anything connected to this, he tapped the table once. Not hard, but it echoed. You will resign, publicly, or be arrested, publicly. Silence again. He rose. This is not politics. This is soul work. And with that, he gathered the folder, turned his back to the room, and walked out, leaving behind not a table but a battlefield. The ministers remained seated, the photographs still staring up at them. And slowly, silently, the cabinet room turned red, not from rage but from truth finally laid bare. It started not with a raid but with a map, a single dot circled in red ink, then 2, then 23. They weren't mines, not directly. They were names, small logistics firms, unremarkable shell companies, discrete bank accounts registered in places most maps didn't bother to print anymore. But the dust didn't lie. It stuck to records, to shipping crates, to forged invoices and falsified manifests. And if you followed it long enough, it began to speak. Within 48 hours of the cabinet meeting, Traoré launched Operation Eveil Awakening, a silent but sweeping initiative targeting the unseen arteries of what he now called a trafficking economy, hidden beneath a development handshake. Customs agents received sealed orders. Inspectors revisited forgotten warehouses. A task force within the central bank was mobilized to audit offshore movements masked as fertilizer, solar panels, agricultural grants. Except they weren't. They were gold, moved in powder, flake, and wire, smuggled across 3 borders, then sanitized by false documentation, and always routed through the same 2 courier firms, both registered in Geneva, but quietly operating out of Ouagadougou. When investigators raided one of the warehouses, they found nothing but stacked crates labeled educational supplies. But inside, smelter-grade concentrate. The paperwork was perfect. Too perfect. Stamped, signed, and backed by a charity front that hadn't posted a real project in 7 years. Traoré read the reports each night alone with a pen in hand, but no margin wide enough to hold his anger. Then came the visit. An envoy from a development bloc, dressed sharp cologne, too clean for this climate accent, polished to a sheen. He didn't knock. He arrived with appointments arranged through appropriate channels. Traoré didn't smile. He met him in the secondary room of the presidential office. No flags, no translators. Just 2 chairs and a file. The envoy opened his case. Phrases like strategic realignment and mutual benefit slid off his tongue like oil on glass. He spoke of debt forgiveness, of revised export quotas, of access to rare medical equipment. He even mentioned a scholarship program for displaced girls, as if the wounds could be numbed by brochures. And finally, too casually, he folded his hands and said, "Of course, President Traoré, we understand the public must see justice. But if some of these networks touch entities affiliated with international partners, it might be wise to temper the approach. Quiet resolutions avoid market fear, especially when dealing with such delicate trade corridors." There was no smile in Traoré's reply. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He simply stood, walked to the window, looked out at the courtyard where children rescued from the mines were now playing with paper soccer balls made from old medical gloves. Then, without turning around, he said, "Burkina children will never be currency." The envoy blinked. "Excuse me. You asked me to temper justice to protect trade, to protect donors. You came with words, and under your words there are numbers. And under those numbers is blood." He turned now, eyes calm but cold. "There will be no quiet resolutions, no safe corridors for those who walked over children. If your partners are entangled, cut them loose, or be dragged down with them." The envoy tried to laugh. "Surely, Mr. President, you're not suggesting I'm not suggesting. I'm informing." Silence. The envoy stood case in hand. He offered a nod that landed like a blade, sharp and short. As he left, Traoré returned to his desk. He didn't watch the man go. Instead, he circled another name on the report. A courier executive, Senegalese passport, Swiss address, listed as a consultant, paid in cash. He underlined it, then wrote in the margin, "Follow the dust." The order came before dawn. No national address, no press release. Just a single line, classified but absolute, sent to every regional governor, military unit, and resource ministry official across the northern corridor. Effective immediately, all gold extraction operations within 200 kilometers of the Burkina Faso border are to be suspended indefinitely. Machines stopped. Trucks turned around mid-route. At checkpoints, convoys loaded with ore were redirected, some impounded on the spot. Licenses, many of them forged, others simply too vague, were frozen. GPS towers at known processing zones were taken offline. And just like that, Burkina Faso paused gold. Not because it could afford to, but because it couldn't afford not to. Within hours, international wires lit up. Burkina Faso halts all gold activity amid alleged human rights violations. Analysts speculated. Traders panicked. But Traoré said nothing to the press. He didn't need to. His silence was deliberate. And the silence itself spoke louder than panic ever could. Inside the Situation Bureau, the task force unfolded a new wall of evidence, lines and logos, spreadsheets and redacted memos. At the center of it all, two cryptic codes kept surfacing: XJ, MTL full. At first they meant nothing. Initials without names. Shadows. But then one of the forensic analysts, a woman who had worked in freight audits for a decade, froze in front of a manifest. "I've seen this before," she whispered. 2 years ago, during an investigation into illegal cobalt routes in Central Africa, the name MTL Full had appeared on a forged customs entry registered as a logistics integrator with no real address. Cross-checking that with the serials on gold transport crates from the Valley Mine revealed a match. The phrase XJ appeared in margin notes, likely shorthand used internally, but when traced through transport software logs from a European air freight system, it pinged again, linked to a holding company headquartered in Cyprus with directors in Geneva and Dubai. Traoré circled the names. Lines began to connect. Not just labor violations, but a laundering structure, one that moved not only gold, but silence. A machine engineered to erase who touched what and at what cost. He stood before the map, now filled with pins, red lines, and names scrawled in urgency. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the threads, at the routes carved through sovereign soil, at the prophets built on backs bent under sun and stone. Then he said, "They thought gold would blind us, but it only helped us see them." A pause, his voice lower now to those in the room. "We will follow every crate, every code, every account, and every lie." He stepped back from the board, the gravity of the moment hanging in the stillness. "We will follow them not for revenge, but for reckoning." And the room, once filled with murmurs and map pins, fell completely silent. The order came at 03:41. No sirens, no headlines, no noise. Just a whisper across encrypted channels. "Execute Operation Silence no more." They moved like shadows. 3 transport trucks, 2 unmarked helos, 12 men and women in desert-grade armor faces, painted the color of soil, hearts beating in sync with something heavier than adrenaline, justice, measured not in bullets, but in broken silence. By 03:58, they had surrounded the compound, an abandoned textile plant along the northern trade corridor repurposed by a phantom firm listed as extra interlog. The paperwork claimed it held storage for non-ferrous mineral residue, but satellite scans had shown movement small bodies often hunched gathered in rows before dawn, disappearing into the back hall by dusk. At exactly 04:00 they breached. No explosions, just a click of a magnetic latch, the glide of reinforced doors, the cold hush of breath held too long. What they found inside was not a factory. It was a prison dressed in silence. There were no lights, only a few flickering bulbs strung along a ceiling, warped with mold. The air was metallic, heavy, the walls lined with tarpaulin to muffle sound. But behind them rooms, dozens, each no bigger than a storage closet, and inside children, curled against walls, barefoot, some asleep, some too tired to close their eyes. One child stood when the first soldier entered, not in alarm but in recognition, as if he had seen this moment in a dream too fragile to believe. He didn't scream, he didn't run. He walked slowly forward and hugged the soldier. Others followed, tiny feet padding through dust, arms outstretched, not shaking but steady. Soldiers knelt to their knees as dozens of small arms wrapped around them. Some cried, most didn't. They just held on as if afraid that if they blinked, the rescue might vanish. One medic later wrote, "It wasn't fear in their faces. It was relief. It was like they were telling us, 'You're late, but we knew you'd come.'" In the deepest room chained to a pipe, they found a teenager, maybe 15. He didn't move when the door opened. His lips were split. His shirt had once been white. A soldier knelt, flashlight low. "Are you hurt?" The boy nodded once. "Can you walk?" He paused, then looked up, and with a voice rasped dry, he answered, "Only forward." They carried him out last. By 05:17, all 38 captives, 33 minors, 5 women were aboard the evac transport. Medical triage began immediately. Nutrient gels, IV fluids, thermal blankets. One soldier offered her canteen to a girl who drank as if tasting water for the first time. Outside, the sky began to pale, the edge of morning pressing against a night too long. A captain radioed the Situation Bureau. Target neutralized. All civilians secured. Standing by for Phase 2. Back at HQ, Traoré stood before a satellite screen watching live telemetry of the evac route. His hands were behind his back. He said nothing, but the furrow in his brow had eased just slightly. An aide approached. "Sir, shall we announce the rescue?" He didn't turn. He simply replied, "Not yet," then softer. "We don't need the world to clap. We need it to listen." As the convoy rolled through the awakening countryside, one boy leaned against the window of the truck. He pointed to the flag on the medic's shoulder and asked quietly, "Is that ours?" The medic nodded. "Yes." "Then I want it on my arm too." And somewhere far behind them, in the darkness they left behind, silence finally began to break. Not with noise, but with hope wearing boots. The trucks hummed quietly along the road, leaving behind the compound where screams had once been swallowed by rusted walls and locked doors. Inside the main vehicle, children slept in clusters, heads resting on each other's shoulders. Bodies wrapped in blankets too big for them, finally safe but not yet free of the memories. Private Karim Dio, the youngest in the rescue unit, sat near the back. He was 23, barely out of academy training, and this was his first field mission. Not his first assignment, but the first that left a weight pressing behind his ribs, one that no weapon or uniform could guard against. Across from him, a girl sat curled in her blanket. She hadn't said much since the rescue. Her face was calm, unreadable, like someone who had forgotten what it meant to be a child. But now, as the sun began to paint the morning gold, she reached into the folds of her blanket and carefully pulled out a small folded piece of paper, crease smudged with dust but still intact. She handed it to Karim. "My brother drew this," she said softly. Karim took it, slowly unfolding the corners. It was a drawing done in charcoal or a broken pencil, a tree tall and stark rising from the ground with a thick trunk and sprawling branches. But what stopped him, what twisted something in his chest, was the roots. Because they weren't roots. They were hands, dozens of them, thin, desperate, reaching upward from beneath the earth, clawing toward the trunk, as if trying to pull themselves free or hold the tree up. At the top of the tree, in place of leaves, were tiny faces. Sad, silent, watching. He looked back at the girl. "Where is your brother now?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Karim stared at the paper for a long time. He folded it gently, too gently, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his uniform. That night, when they arrived at the regional care base and the children were moved to temporary shelter tents, Karim sat alone at the edge of the camp. In his hands was a notebook he had carried since basic training. He'd never written in it before, but now he opened it, tore out a page, and began to write. Not a report, not a debriefing, but a letter. "Dear Mama, today I held a child who gave me a drawing of a tree, but it wasn't a tree. It was pain disguised as branches. The roots were hands of people buried under the soil of silence. She said her brother drew it. She didn't say where he was. I already knew. Mama, they didn't fight with guns. They fought by surviving. They stayed alive long enough for us to find them. And that takes more courage than any battlefield I've trained for. I want you to know I didn't cry in front of them. But I did cry. Not out of weakness, out of respect. I saw children who held soldiers like they were family. Not because they were scared, but because they were finally safe enough to hope. And that's why I write this. Not to make sense of what I saw, but to remind myself we are not just here to protect, we are here to witness. Love, Karim." Weeks later, that letter would be found in a military newsletter. It would spread through barracks and family groups, read at small ceremonies, photocopied onto walls in refugee camps. And across the bottom in quiet script, someone had written, "May the tree grow," but never from hands again. They gathered not in a courtroom, but in a circle of shade beneath a wide-boughed tree. No podium, no gavels, just a worn wooden bench, a cloth mat for sitting, and the soft hum of wind pressing through dry grass. It was called the Toa Anjat, the Court of the Earth. Traoré had insisted on the name himself. Not a court of punishment, he said, not a place of prosecution or political theater, but of presence, of remembering. If we do not record the truth in the voice of those who bore it, he had told his advisors, we will bury it under statistics. And pain deserves better than numbers. So they came one by one. Survivors, mothers, children, minors, those who had escaped and those who had remained, some with voices, some still choosing silence, but all with eyes that had seen what should never be seen and feet that had walked out of shadows deeper than maps could mark. The first woman stepped forward slowly. Her back was curved not from age but from years of being forced to kneel for hours under sun and stone. She didn't speak at first. She knelt down, touched the ground, then looked up, not at Traoré, not at the other witnesses, but at the sky. And then she whispered, "We didn't forget the sky. We just forgot how to look up." No one replied. No one needed to. Her words didn't fill the silence. They opened it, made space for it to be holy. She spoke then, not in a speech, but in moments. The way they buried food in their clothes. How they hummed old songs to stay sane. The day her sister collapsed in the pit and the guard didn't stop her fall. How her son, only 7, became her protector. Each word was planted like a seed. Some raw, some quiet, but all rooted in truth. Others followed. A boy spoke of drawing trees with hand roots. A mother recalled smuggling a radio piece by piece to play a voice that said, "You are not what they made you do." A former guard face covered in shame sat at the edge of the circle, crying, but saying nothing. Not yet. Each testimony wasn't just a recounting. It was a reclamation of time, of voice, of something deeper, the right to be heard and not edited. Traoré didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He sat like the others on the ground, his sleeves rolled, head slightly bowed. Sometimes he took notes. Other times he just listened with both hands clasped, as if trying to hold the weight of every word in his palms. By the end of the day, the court had not convicted anyone, but it had done something more powerful. It had named the pain, and once pain has a name, it can no longer be buried. The room was made of marble and microphones. The National Assembly Hall, once a stage for policies, promises, and political theater, now stood completely still. Ministers in tailored suits, journalists with badges clipped tight, delegates from partner nations, all seated, all quiet, all watching. At the center of the hall, beneath the Great Seal of the Republic, stood a small wooden platform bare. No podium, no lectern, no barrier between the speaker and the room. And into that space stepped Chidima. No security detail, no speechwriters, no translator trailing behind. Just her. She wore no formal gown, no makeup. Just a plain ash-gray dress, sleeves rolled to her forearms, the familiar red cloth draped across one shoulder, not as decoration, but as declaration. She stood for a moment, letting the silence hold. Then she took a step forward, not to rise above the assembly, but to meet it. No microphone had been requested. She didn't need one. She spoke. "My name is Chidima Ebere." Her voice didn't boom. It didn't tremble. It carried like wind over dry leaves, soft but impossible to ignore. "I am not a lawyer. I am not an elected leader. I am not from your capital. I come from a place where names were taken and numbers were stitched into skin, not paper." She paused. The ministers leaned in almost involuntarily. "I speak today not because I am healed. I am not. I speak because silence is heavier than pain." A rustle in the gallery. One of the foreign delegates sat straighter. Several others took notes. We dug with fingers. We drank rust. We were told our value ended when our use ended. And even then they called us waste. She inhaled, but not to steady herself. To continue. "But I am not waste. We are not machines. We are not shame. We are names." The line landed like thunder on glass. Quietly, powerfully, it cracked something in the air. Chidima glanced toward the back rows where survivors sat in simple clothes. Some clasped hands. Some simply stared. They weren't here for pity. They were here because they had earned the right to witness this moment. "You ask how this happened," she continued. "How such things were done on your land, under your flag, with your systems watching, but saying nothing. It didn't begin with cruelty. It began with convenience. A silence here, a shortcut there. And soon a life becomes a ledger. A girl becomes a risk. And no one says a word." A few ministers lowered their eyes. One wiped his glasses with a shaking hand. Chidima didn't accuse. She didn't threaten. She testified. "I do not speak for revenge. I speak for memory. Because when we remember with truth, we rebuild with honor." She took one final breath. "So call us by our names. Let our stories be written not in hidden files, but in your laws. Not in apologies, but in action." And then she stepped back. One step. Just enough to mark that she had said all she came to say. No applause followed. None was needed. The silence that came after her words was not empty. It was full. Full of recognition. Full of weight. Full of the kind of stillness that only comes when the truth finally arrives without permission. And in that silence, Traoré, seated among the officials, head bowed, stood up. Not as president, but as a man bearing witness. One by one, others followed. The hall remained silent, but every person stood, not to praise her, but because she had stood first. They played her voice on the radio before sunrise, just after the morning prayer, in the quiet space between weather updates and grain price reports. No music underneath, no introduction, just the recording, clear, steady her voice. "We are not machines. We are not shame. We are names." And across the country, people stopped. In villages where radios hung from wires under mango trees, old men who'd lost sons in the mines sat up straighter. In city buses, students froze mid-scroll phones, still in their hands, staring out the windows, as if her words had shaken the dust off the glass. In markets, women turned down the stoves to listen fully, not because they were told to, but because they remembered what it felt like to be unseen. In the Capitol, in a cramped classroom with peeling paint and desks made from recycled doors, a teacher paused her lesson. The chalk still hovered above the board halfway through a sentence about verbs. On the windowsill, a radio played the last echo of Chidima's voice. Silence lingered for a moment after. Then a small hand rose in the back of the class. Madam, the teacher turned. "Yes, Malik." The boy's voice was soft, curious. "Is Chidima a president?" A few students giggled. The teacher smiled, not mockingly, but gently, as if the boy had spoken something too wise to laugh at. She stepped away from the board, turned the volume on the radio down, and said, "Not yet." The class fell silent again. But this time it wasn't out of confusion. It was out of consideration. At a roadside food stall, A young woman wiped tears with the corner of her apron as the radio replayed the speech. She hadn't cried in years, even when her brother disappeared crossing the northern line. But something about the way Chidima said, "We are names," cracked something she didn't know was still soft. In a small clinic, a midwife who had delivered 100 children in silence whispered the lines out loud, almost like a prayer. "Let our stories be written not in hidden files, but in your laws." She wrote it down, taped it to the wall beside a blood pressure chart. In a government office tucked behind the Ministry of Labor, a clerk, usually indifferent, printed the transcript 3 times. One copy for his drawer, one for the break room, and one he folded and placed into an envelope for his daughter studying abroad. "So she knows what dignity sounds like," he said quietly. Everywhere something shifted, not loudly, not with celebration, but with recognition. Like the country had been holding its breath for so long, it forgot it could exhale. And in that breath, Chidima's voice moved not as speech, but as memory waking up. She didn't promise. She didn't demand. She reminded. And sometimes that's more powerful than law. That evening, as the sun dipped into gold and orange, and radios played her voice one last time, before NewsHour, the teacher sat at her desk alone grading papers. She looked again at the last essay Malik had turned in. It was messy, misspelled. But at the top, scrawled in pencil, "My name is Malik. I am not shame." She put her red pen down and smiled through tears. Every morning just after the rooster crowed, but before the sun fully claimed the sky, a small circle formed again beneath the tree. It was the land court, the court of the earth. And at its heart sat a man older than most stones in the square. Judge Salifu Bamba, once the highest magistrate in the Republic, now returned from retirement, not to rule but to listen. He didn't wear robes, he wore linen, no hammer, no bench. Just a notebook on his lap and his voice steady as dawn. Each session he began the same way. No matter the wind, no matter the crowd, no matter how raw the story about to be shared. Today, he said, eyes sweeping across survivors, villagers, students, soldiers. We record, not erase. Those 5 words became sacred. They weren't just an opening. They were a line drawn in time, a refusal to let memory rot in silence, a promise that pain once spoken would live not to torment, but to teach. Witnesses came from across the country. A grandmother with a string of names tattooed on her thigh so she wouldn't forget her family. A former security guard who once turned keys in an underground mine, now trembling as he confessed. Children who didn't speak yet but drew. And it was one such drawing that caught everyone's breath one morning. A boy no older than 8 walked to the front. He said nothing, but he handed Judge Salifo a single sheet of paper. Folded carefully, smudged with charcoal, maybe ash. When Salifu opened it, he paused. The image showed a soldier, back-bent, face calm, carrying a small child on his shoulders. Behind them, tense. Dust. A red cloth fluttering like a flag. At the bottom of the page, in unsteady handwriting, "This is the day we came back to life." No one clapped. No one spoke. But something in that moment, something wordless settled, like a wound finally beginning to close from the inside out. Judge Salifu turned the paper around, showing it to the circle. Then he nodded once with tears in his voice, if not in his eyes. "Let this image be part of our record." From that day on, the court kept not only testimonies, but drawings, lullabies, fragments of fabric, handwritten notes smuggled in pockets, evidence not for punishment, but for memory. Because justice here wasn't about courtrooms or convictions. It was about something deeper, a justice that restored, not erased, that gave names back, that gave stories form, that told the world we remember you. And in remembering, we refused to let the dark be final. The ceremony was quiet. No marching bands, no trumpets, just the wind curling through the valley and the soft crunch of footsteps on dry earth. Children stood in a circle holding small white stones in their palms. Survivors lined the outer edge, some with scarves over their hair, others with nothing but the dust on their sleeves. At the center of the space, once the pit of Mine XJ now filled, flattened and ringed with young trees, stood a scaffold, and on it a statue still veiled. It wasn't made of bronze or marble. It wasn't flown in from a national gallery or designed by a famous sculptor. It was made from the clay of the mine itself, the very earth children had bled into, the same dirt that had coated their hands when they dug for gold they would never see. mixed with water, sand, and ash, shaped not by one artist, but by many survivors, villagers, students, soldiers, even strangers who had come to listen, all pressing their hands into its form, adding layers, smoothing edges, shaping memory. The statue showed a mother kneeling. Her face wasn't modeled after anyone in particular, but somehow it looked like all of them. In her arms she held a child, not curled in fear, not limp, but awake, head resting on her shoulder, arms draped loosely around her neck, as if finally able to sleep without watching. At her feet, a single bloom of clay wheat just beginning to rise. Traoré stood with Chidima near the front. The wind tugged gently at the red cloth on her shoulder. She was quiet, gaze fixed on the statue as if it were breathing. A girl stepped forward, perhaps 7, and slowly pulled the veil from the figure. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some clapped softly. Others just stood, lips trembling, eyes shining. But it was Chidima who moved next. She walked toward the statue, not ceremoniously, not rehearsed, and placed her palm on the figure's chest. For a moment she said nothing. Then, almost in a whisper, loud enough only for the front rows to hear, "You held us, even when we didn't know it." Someone wept behind her, a former miner. An old woman whispered a prayer into her scarf. A boy closed his hand around his white stone like a secret. No speeches were given, no political slogans were chanted. But something far deeper settled over the valley. The earth had remembered, and now so had they. As the crowd began placing their white stones around the base of the statue, some in circles, others in spirals, a young sculptor leaned toward a foreign journalist and said softly, "This isn't a monument to pain, it's a garden, made of the same clay that once buried the truth. Now it grows it." Later that day, the children helped plant seedlings around the site. Some held watering cans. Others gently pressed roots into the red soil. One child laughed genuinely loudly when water splashed back onto his boots. It was the kind of laugh that made elders turn and smile, remembering something they hadn't heard in a long, long time. And as the sun tilted toward dusk, light caught the curve of the statue's shoulder, warm, golden, soft. The mother held the child still, and the child slept on, finally home. The gate was made of repurposed steel, bent, scrubbed, and painted white. It stood where the old access road to Mine XJ used to begin, where convoys once rolled in carrying silence and rolled out carrying gold. Now it led somewhere else entirely. Above it, in bold black letters carved into a single slab of wood, hung the name Chidima School of Strength, no marble, no fanfare, just a name. But that name carried more than any monument ever could. It was the first school in the region to be built entirely with local materials and local hands: earth brick walls, solar roofs, chalkboards made from smooth minestone. Even the desks were crafted by the same workers who once built crates for smuggled minerals. And on its first day, the children walked in barefoot in lines of 2, many of them holding hands, not because they were told to, but because they were used to holding on. The old pit was gone, filled and sealed. The memory of what had happened there remained, but above it now stood 6 bright classrooms, a library, a vegetable garden, and a water well with 3 working taps. In the center courtyard, a mural covered the east wall. Painted by local artists and children together, it showed not scenes of suffering, but growth trees rising, girls reading, boys writing an open book with hands lifting out of it like wings. During the opening, there was no ribbon to cut. Instead, Chidima herself walked the children through the gate, one hand on a boy's shoulder, the other holding the palm of a girl no older than 7. As they passed under the sign, the girl looked up, eyes wide, and whispered, "It makes me feel taller." Chidima knelt beside her. "Why, little one?" The girl pointed at the sign again. "Because now we go up to learn, not down to dig." Inside one of the new classrooms, chalk dust floated in rays of sunlight, like tiny ghosts dancing. The teacher herself, once a refugee, stood barefoot at the board, drawing the number 1 as the children echoed, laughing. In the library, a boy sat at a desk, tracing letters with his finger. On his page it read, "My name is not a number." He underlined the word name. Outside, the bell wasn't a buzzer or alarm. It was a cowbell salvaged from a nearby farm, soft, human, earthy. When it rang, children spilled out onto the courtyard, where they played tag around the new saplings that lined the field. Traoré visited without bodyguards, carrying a small book wrapped in cloth. Tales of Sky and Soil, a children's storybook, written from the testimonies gathered at the court of the earth. He donated it to the library with a single inscription: for every child who knew more than they should have and still chose to dream. That night, after the students had gone home, Chidima stood alone beneath the gate. Her hand traced the carved letters, still smelling faintly of varnish and sun. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Behind her, laughter still echoed in the yard. Ahead of her, lanterns flickered along the road. And above her, her name stood, not as a title, not as a symbol of power, but as a beacon. Proof that even in places built to bury life, the future can stand taller. The mornings at the Chidima School of Strength began not with bells, but with a song. Not one written by a composer, not found in any hymnal, but a song born from playground dust, from pencil stubs, from the breath of children who had lived too long in silence. They sang it barefoot in uniforms too big, with voices untrained, but unmistakably alive. Standing in rows beneath the rising sun, back straight, eyes shining not in pride but in readiness. We are not what we were forced to do. We are what we choose to learn. Some sang it loud, some whispered, some mouthed the word, still learning to believe them. But every voice was part of the same chorus, a declaration not just of healing, but of agency. Above them, arched into the curve of the school gate, a new plaque had been mounted just days before. Its words were simple, but they held the weight of centuries. Your story begins again here, not begins here, but begins again. Because these children had already lived stories, ones too harsh, too early, too wrong. But now in this place, they were not trapped in those beginnings. They were authors now. Inside the library, a boy traced his fingers across the spines of donated books. Some were in French, some in English, some in Fulfulde. He didn't care about the language. He only cared that his fingers had the power to choose. In the science room, two girls stood over a seedling sprouting in a jar. One leaned close and whispered, "It's trying again." The other smiled and whispered back, "So are we." Chidima often returned to the school unannounced. She never made a speech. She didn't sit in offices or classrooms. She wandered through hallways, over courtyard tiles still warm from the sun, through gardens where tiny carrots were beginning to peek up. One afternoon, she stood quietly at the gate, watching the children run laps for gym class. The coach clapped her hands and called, "Feet forward, shoulders high. We're not tired, we're training." A small boy fell. Another boy stopped to help him up. Neither said anything, but the coach smiled and nodded. That's strength. In a quiet corner of the campus, there was a wall covered in handprints, each one dipped in paint blue, red, gold, green, stamped beside a name written in uneven letters. Children who had lived the mine, children who had escaped it, children who had simply learned from its shadow. A guide once asked a teacher, "Is this a memorial?" The teacher shook her head. "No," she said, "it's a beginning." And each evening, when the final song echoed through the valley, sometimes imperfect, sometimes off-key, but always sincere, it carried with it the most powerful truth of all, that to be free is not only to survive, it is to choose every single day to become more than what tried to break you. The valley was no longer quiet. Where dust once hung like sorrow in the air, now sunflowers lined the path. Where cries had echoed off steel and stone, now laughter rang clear, bouncing across newly painted walls. The school had grown. 2 more buildings, a solar tower, a shaded reading garden. The trees planted a decade ago now formed a leafy canopy above the courtyard. And walking beneath that canopy was Kosi, now 21 tall, composed, and carrying a red cap in his hand. He stopped for a moment at the gate. The plaque still read, "Your story begins again here." He smiled. He had walked through this gate many times as a student, but today he walked in as the new youth director for the district, the youngest ever appointed. The red cap he held wasn't flashy, but it was simple, a soft woven cotton marked with a faded stitch on the back. It had once belonged to his brother. Kosi never wore it as a costume or badge. He wore it as memory, folded neatly when he worked, resting on his head when he led. As he entered the courtyard, children swarmed him. "Kosi, are you really the new big boss? Did you bring the storybook again? Can we plant more mango trees this week?" He knelt laughing, pulling notebooks from his bag, handing them out like small seeds. "No bosses here, only builders," he said. He guided them to the mural wall, now twice as large. Pointing at an older part of the painting, a soldier carrying a child, he touched the foot of the painted child. "That was me," he said quietly. The children gasped. One of them stared at him wide-eyed. "But you don't look scared now." "Because I'm not," he said. "But I remember why I was. That's how I keep others from feeling the same." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small tin. Inside were red caps, smaller versions, each hand-stitched by women in the local cooperative. He placed one on a girl's head, another on a shy boy in the back. "Not for fighting," he said, "for remembering, for leading, for lifting." And as the sun spilled across the courtyard, the red caps gleamed not in anger, but in honor. Later that week, Kosi led a group of new students to the far side of the valley. The original mine perimeter, now a memorial garden filled with wind trees, steel frames covered in fluttering fabric squares, each marked with a name. Some squares were embroidered, others drawn in chalk or marker. Some held symbols, a foot a hand, a book a star. They gathered around the oldest tree where the names from the original rescue were kept. Kosi stood beside them, a notebook in his hand, his red cap tucked behind his ear. "You don't have to remember the pain," he told them gently, "but you must name it." One boy raised his hand. "But what if we don't know the names?" Kosi smiled. "Then give them new ones. Names are not just what they were called, they're what we remember them by." He handed out pencils and strips of cloth. The children began to write not only names they knew, but names they imagined. Grace Ayo, little sister who waited, he sang in the pit one, who still dreams. A small girl no more than 6 stood at the edge of the group, silent. She held a crumpled paper in her fist. When Kosi knelt beside her, she opened it. It was a drawing, a mother, kneeling, holding a child. At the bottom in shaky lettering it said, "She never let go." Kosi studied it. "Did you draw this?" The girl shook her head. "No, my brother did. But he doesn't draw anymore. I do now." He placed the drawing at the base of the tree, anchoring it with a small white stone. "It's beautiful," he said. She nodded. "It makes me brave." Kosi didn't speak. He just touched the brim of his cap and smiled. Later that day, the wind blew gently, fluttering the cloth, names like breath. And the valley, once suffocated by silence, now whispered with stories. Each square, a voice returned to the world. It had been years since Ibrahim Traoré walked the valley without guards. No cameras, no flags. Just a man in worn shoes and sleeves, rolled to the elbow, stepping quietly along a stone path carved by time and memory. He passed the school, the new dormitories, the memorial trees. Every wall bore signs of growth, not forced, chosen. And then he came to it, the old mine marker still preserved as a single block of ironstone, with an inscription carved by hand, now faint with age. "This ground no longer takes from us. It gives." Traoré ran his fingers across the words. So much had been taken. Time, childhoods, names, even faith. But something had been returned, not in gold, but in memory. He sat on the bench near the marker, quiet. The wind carried faint echoes of children's laughter from the school. A voice broke his thoughts. "Excuse me, mister." He turned. A small girl stood near the bench, clutching a notebook. Her braids were uneven and her shoes were too big. "Are you—" She paused, eyes narrowing as if matching a memory. "Are you the man from the radio?" Traoré chuckled just slightly. "I was," he said. She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Was he looked toward the school. "Because now I want to hear your voice instead." The girl beamed. She sat beside him without asking. "I wrote a poem," she said. "Can I read it?" "Please do." And so she read, her voice soft but certain, words about trees and hands and skies that could not be stolen. When she finished, she looked up. "Was it good?" Traoré nodded. It was true. "That makes it better than good." He stood brushing dust from his knees and offered her a handshake. She took it, then laughed. "You shake hands like a teacher." "I've had a lot of teachers," he said, "some of them very small." As he walked away, the girl waved. "Goodbye, man from the radio." He raised his hand without turning back. "Goodbye, voice of the valley." And with that, the sun began to set behind the hills, no longer casting shadows over the mine, but warmth over something new. A place that had once buried names now lifted them. A country that had once whispered now sang. And somewhere in the distance, beneath a sky that finally belonged to everyone again, a red cap hung on a classroom hook, waiting for the next child ready to lead. This story reminds us that justice is not only about punishment, it's about restoring dignity. From silence to song, from the depths of a mine to the height of a child's voice, we witness how memory can rebuild what cruelty tried to erase. Chidima and Kosi show us that leadership is not loud, it's steady, human, and rooted in truth. Real change begins not in courtrooms but in classrooms, gardens, and the stories we dare to pass on. What would it mean if we treated every child's voice like a seed and listened as if the world depended on it? If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.